We have to understand this divide that is occurring right now between these two kind of philosophical schools. When we use a distinction like empiricism versus rationalism, we're often using those terms as kind of broad characterizations that are not exact. That is one of these distinctions that is really more so about general tendencies than it is something that can be, every figure can kind of be grabbed onto and squeezed into one of those two categories exclusively. And so with a lot of the thinkers that we generally think of as empiricists or rationalists, there's a bit of mix of things here. So that's just an important qualification as we jump into understanding what this distinction is. If there's anyone that's just like completely anti-rationalism in the fullest sense, it would be David Hume. So he's kind of the most extreme among the rationalists here. So essentially, this division between empiricism and rationalism is a way to understand the ways in which knowledge is gained by an individual. And so the empiricist focuses on experience. So the empiricist is one who's going to focus on knowledge as that which is gained or derived through one's experiences in the world. So there is a focus on sense experience, what somebody learns through the senses, through what they hear and what they see, and the various events that occur within their lives. The rationalists, instead, in contrast, are going to focus on knowledge as it arises from innate ideas. So when I say innate ideas, we're talking about ideas that are essential to us, that are present within us, that we didn't learn from anywhere, right? So this is the notion that there are certain concepts that just exist within the mind that we didn't have to, learn from a teacher or learn from parents or learn from just experiencing the world. They're things that are kind of inherent to the structures of our minds or the structures of our thought. So knowledge arises from innate ideas as part of rationalism, and the other is that there is this focus on knowledge that is rationally deduced through logical reasoning. So there is an optimism about what the human intellect is actually capable of, what it is that we are capable of knowing. The empiricists tend to be a lot more skeptical about what reason or what the human mind is really capable of understanding in its own powers. And so the rationalists believe that we can rationally deduce all sorts of truths about the world, about the universe, about us, about God, depending on who the rationalist is, that we can discover all of these truths by means of reason alone. And here in this image on the slide, I know some of you are just listening to the podcast, but on the slide, there's an image of John Locke and René Descartes. And these are kind of two great representatives of both of these schools of thought. And so John Locke is an empiricist. John Locke is famous for his political philosophy, but also his work on human knowledge. John Locke is the one who speaks about the human mind as a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. This idea that the human mind basically has nothing kind of imprinted on it at the moment of birth, and so that all of our knowledge is this imprinting of these various experiences and sensations throughout life, which accounts for knowledge. René Descartes is one who begins his philosophical system trying to find an indisputable ground of knowledge and then reasoning out from there. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means in just a minute. Empiricism is generally the go-to methodology in Britain. And so sometimes this will be called British empiricism. You'll hear that phrase used a lot. Major figures that are associated with empiricism are Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. Rationalism was instead prominent on the continent of Europe. So generally they are not going to be from the UK. So we've got René Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza. So then let's talk about rationalism in a little more detail. That's your very basic, broad distinction between rationalism and empiricism. What are the basic ideas of Descartes that form his rationalism? Now, the first kind of maybe most essential element of this is what I already alluded to just a minute ago here, and that is that knowledge, real knowledge, true knowledge, derives from an indisputable ground of fact. And this attempt to do this begins prior to Descartes. Pierre Chiron is doing this popularly in France just prior to Descartes. And Sharon essentially tries to find some kind of a place where there is something that is basically indisputed, right? And he says that, we need to find, if we want to have real knowledge, like committed, actual, complete certainty. I'm talking about certitude, really. Certitude necessitates some kind of indisputable, definitive place upon which knowledge can rest. And Sharon comes to the conclusion that we just can't find that. and so Sharon was a skeptic in a lot of ways. And he has this kind of thoroughgoing skepticism, and Sharon's very much okay with that. Descartes is not okay with that skepticism. So what Descartes wants to do is prove that there is such a definitive ground of knowledge that we can indeed build on and have certitude about what is real, and have certitude about what reality is, how we can know who we are as human beings, whether God exists, those kinds of major questions. So Descartes believes that he has found this indisputable ground of knowledge within self-knowledge. And so Descartes has the very famous phrase, "I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum." And so that particular phrase defines René Descartes, the beginning of René Descartes' philosophies. This is in his book Meditations on First Philosophy. And so he begins with this kind of doubt, skepticism, and asks all these skeptical questions. And then he comes to this conclusion, well, if I can doubt all sorts of things, one thing I can't doubt is that doubting is happening. And if doubting is happening, you've got to have somebody that's actually doing the doubting. So the doubter exists. And that's where he comes up with this phrase, "I think, therefore I am." So he's saying that, well, if I'm thinking, I at least know that I exist. And then Descartes provides a couple arguments from there for the existence of God. And so his arguments for the existence of God then prove to him, okay, I exist. And from there, I can argue that God exists. And from God's existence, now I can reason to the trustworthiness of the kind of senses that God has given me, because if God exists and God is good, he would not simply deceive me throughout my life and make me think that all sorts of things are real that are not. So we have this kind of general reliability on the senses. So Descartes really begins with skepticism, but ends without skepticism. And that's the goal of his project, is to say that that there are indisputable rational reasons to not be an absolute skeptic about everything. We're going to see that Hume kind of grabs onto that and says, actually, Descartes, that's not indisputable at all, and moves the kind of needle back toward this skepticism. And then Immanuel Kant kind of comes along and tries to deal with the skepticism of David Hume. So along with this, there's the basis in Descartes there. But along with understanding Descartes, it's important to understand a little bit of what are just some of those ideas that are essential to rationalism, besides just that indisputable ground of knowledge. And one of those is innate ideas, which I had just mentioned. Now, the idea of innate ideas, this notion that there are things that we know to be true, that we believe to be true, that are just part of our human nature, that are not derived from anything. This idea is not something that's new with the rationalists within modernity. This really goes back to Plato. In Plato's dialogue, the Meno, there is this discussion between Socrates and this slave boy who doesn't have an education. And through a series of questions, Socrates kind of discovers that this boy knows truths about mathematics that he had never learned from anywhere. And so out of this comes this idea that knowledge is really recollection. That when we are learning things, we are in some sense drawing upon something innate that is already within us. And for Plato, this derives from his idea of the preexistence of the soul. And so this is going to take different forms in various different figures, not usually identified with the preexistence of the soul, though, Origen of Alexandria maybe is an exception to that rule. But for the most part, that's not going to be adopted. Okay. But nonetheless, there's still plenty of validity to what Plato is getting at here in this dialogue. Now, Descartes, when he speaks about innate ideas, sometimes there's a bit of a misunderstanding, I think, of what innate ideas are. Descartes is not saying, like Plato seems to be, that there are these just fully formed concepts that everyone just has. For Descartes, it's more that these ideas are like a potential that exists in the mind, right? There is a kind of tendency toward believing or adopting certain truths. So it may not be these kind of fully formed, clear, doctrines that exist within the mind from, conception or whatever. Instead, this is just that human beings have these potentialities that exist within nature that are then kind of actualized, though he's not really going to use those Aristotelian categories too much, but actualized through our experiences and the way that we reason throughout life. Leibniz has a distinction here that's used a bit, talking about innate ideas, and this distinction is between necessary ideas and then those ideas which are not necessary. They're generally like more contingent ideas. And so we're talking about innate ideas. We're talking really about those things which are universal truths, those things which are necessary truths. We have this distinction that Immanuel Kant later is going to make between a priori and a posteriori truths. A priori truths are those truths which are not derived from experience. And a posteriori truths are those things which are derived from experience. The a priori truths are those which are universal. They are not contingent. They are necessary realities. And so the rationalists are generally going to talk a bit about these kind of necessary ideas or universal ideas, rather than just looking at particular experience. And Leibniz discusses this with this categorization of possible worlds. This becomes really essential to 20th century analytic philosophy, but it derives from Leibniz. And essentially what Leibniz is saying is, there are certain things that could be different in a theoretical possible world, but there are certain things that could not be different because they're just contradictory in another possible world. So, for example, you could conceive that there would be a possible world in which World War I did not happen. Right, there are a number of historical circumstances that had to line up in exactly the right way for that war to break out. And so there is, theoretically, you can just say if X, Y, and Z went differently, then that historical event did not happen. However, there is no possible world in which a bachelor would be a married man. And you could say, well, there's a possible world in which that word identifies something else, but the concept of a bachelor cannot mean that, because the concept of a bachelor is the opposite of that, just necessarily, okay? So it's not a contingent truth. It's not contingent on history or experience. It's a universal reality that such is the case. And arguments for the existence of God today often grab onto that some of those distinctions between possible worlds to say that God is not God is a necessary truth rather than a contingent one. Okay, then we have the question that arises here with innate knowledge. And this is a really essential question for understanding a lot of modern philosophy. And that is, how do our sensory perceptions translate to abstract ideas about things? And so throughout our lives, as we are going about our lives, we perceive all sorts of things in all sorts of ways. These are our sense perceptions. And so we're talking about, we think of as the five senses. But the question is, how does my sense experience, which is really this series of kind of totally divided random encounters, how does that translate to an idea in my mind? Because those two things are very different. If I walk up to a dog, right, and I pet that dog, I have an experience of feeling the dog's fur. I see the dog, and I have the experience of the image of that dog coming into my vision. I hear that dog, right? I hear its barking, which is an experience of something happening within my ears. Or sometimes dogs smell pretty bad, so you got the smell of the dog. Hopefully not tasting the dogs here. So we have all of those elements of our experience that are really totally separate things. So the question is, how do those separate sense experiences, how do I take all of those things and then translate what is a physical experience and then translate that into an idea And not just an idea of the smell and not just an idea of the feel, but a universal idea that encapsulates all of those elements. They're two very different kinds of things. Like the mental conception is a very different thing from the physical interaction that I may have with a particular object. And so this innate idea, this notion of innate ideas, tries to respond to that, to say that because there is this kind of maybe potential for ideas about the world around us that exist within the structures of the mind, that means that when I have these sense experiences, they connect to those innate ideas. The classical way of dealing with this within classical philosophy is, the notion of the forms. That Plato has this idea that there are these immaterial forms or ideas that exist within the mind. They're mental things, but they also exist in some way in reality within the physical things in the world. And so if there is this immateriality, this universal idea that is mental, but also the immaterial is reflected in the material, that means that there is this necessary connection between those things. And we'll see Hume is going to answer that essentially by saying there are no universal things at all, right? There is no real reason to assume that there is such a thing as this unified dog. We assume that that's the case. We operate as if it's the case, but there is no necessary connection between those things per se. Though he is going to have a kind of connection with his notion of impressions and this complex ideas that arise out of impressions that we'll talk about. Okay, so then we have this relationship between intuition and deduction that is essential to the rationalist. That's Leibniz in that image there. Some realities can be intuited by direct experience. That's the a posteriori knowledge I mentioned. That's Kant's distinction. And then other things are known through rational deduction, and that's those a priori truths. So the rationalists have a superiority of reason over experience. That one's kind of obvious just by the name itself, because reason provides universal and indisputable knowledge. And so if reason provides this kind of universal knowledge or knowledge that's not so easily mistaken, it necessarily is superior. Think about, and this is a discussion that occurs with relation to a lot of kind of skepticism of like historic Christian truth claims in terms of historical veracity of the New Testament. There is an argument that says, well, look at history, like just the nature of history as a discipline. So as a discipline, historical history is dealing with probabilities. And what are you doing? You're looking at not even your direct experience, you're looking at someone else's experience and how those other people wrote down their experiences and how that experience was interpreted or passed down. Well, there is a lot of room to doubt. However, when we're dealing with, say, more universal principles or laws, something like, say, the scientific laws that govern the universe, those kinds of things, well, those are pretty universal. We're not dependent upon the experience of somebody else. We're not dealing with probabilities in the same way. We're dealing with universal reality. Mathematics would be an example of this. And so this plays into a lot of Immanuel Kant's ideas. And so the rationalists are very much on the side of trying to say, well, we have to have this kind of superiority of reason over experience. So something like the discipline of history, and I'm not saying the rationalists don't believe in the discipline of history, but that's always going to be kind of secondary because that's never going to get at these universal truths that they believe are greater than that which is contingent within history. Another reason for this is just experience is more likely to be mistaken. And that's what Descartes says, and that's how he operates within his arguments in his Meditations on First Philosophy, in that he speaks about this experience of the experiences he has of the world, and he says, well, I could be deceived, right? People can be crazy. You could be in a dream and have experiences, and those don't correspond to reality. Or so it could be some evil being, manipulating my head, so I think things are real that aren't. But the universal truths of reason are more reliable than that. And then we have this distinction between necessary and contingent truths that I had mentioned with Leibniz here. Okay, and that history is like contingent, and reason by itself is a necessary truth.